Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today's episode is called The Ultimate Encounter, 6 Onboard UFO Experiences. I love talking about all kinds of UFO encounters, whether they're sightings or landings or face-to-face encounters with humanoids. But when people are taken on board, to me, these are the cases that have the most potential to really answer all of the many questions surrounding UFO contact. These are the cases that have the most information, and to me, these are the cases that are the most interesting by far. And I've chosen 6 cases that I think you probably haven't heard of before, and they're certainly interesting because they reach all the way back to the 1920s up through the 1990s. They come from many different locations, including Canada, the United States, South America, more specifically Brazil, but as well as Europe, including Spain and Hungary, and one case from Iran, which is really interesting because we don't get a whole lot of information about UFOs in that country. And of course, these do involve many different types of ETs, humanoids, and also some really interesting and compelling evidence. 2 of these are multiple witness cases. The others are single witness cases, but certainly compelling. Each case adds another piece of the puzzle to what's going on here, and I hope that you will find these cases interesting. So let's just get started. And the first case I'd like to talk about today I call the case of Betty Stewart Dagenais. Her case is really interesting because it involves several encounters. They reach back all the way to the 1920s up through the 1970s and took place primarily in Ontario, Canada. And her case is particularly compelling because it's one of the best examples of the so-called alien implants that we hear so much about. Eddie Stewart Dagenais' case was investigated by a team of UFO researchers from the Canadian UFO Network, and she reports at least 5 onboard UFO encounters. And the first occurred all the way back in 1925 when Betty was only 5 years old. It was a summer night, and Betty was in her parents' home in Port Burwell, Ontario. And as Betty says in her own words, I woke up and felt compelled to go outside in the backyard. I was stricken with terror as a train approached, and I knew it was coming for me. Now, Betty had never heard of UFOs, so she kind of perceived this object as a train. She did not know what to think. It was years later, after having other experiences, that she elected to go under hypnotic regression to recall her experience. And she was taken to this event, and she remembered hearing a quote, throbbing or pulsating whining hum, as this weird light approached her from over Lake Erie. She said it hovered briefly overhead and was wobbling in the sky as she looked up towards it. And the next thing she knew, she was floating up into this object, inside this craft. And as Betty says, everything is very white and light. Things come towards me, small and gray. The eyes are large and far apart. I'm sitting on a bed. So she described these beings as having very large heads, small faces with large bulging eyes, pale white gray skin, and very slender bodies. She said they wore skin-tight coveralls that looked like, quote, stretchy satin. Now at this point, one of the beings called her name and said, Betty, you're a little girl, and floated her up onto a table. They removed her nightgown. She says one of them touched the skin on her bottom, apparently, as she says, trying to see the texture of my body. And they then began to float her around the cabin. And as Betty says, again, under hypnotic regression, there are instruments on a panel, 3 of them. I feel as if I'm dreaming. I want to put my nightgown back on. One of them has a long steel needle. It has things that come out of it, things that drop down. Now the next thing she knew, she was being escorted out of this craft and floated back down to the ground. And as she says, still under hypnosis, I'm standing on the grass. I hear a call from my mother. They had floated me back. I go in the back door. Our collie dog is lying there and won't move. I'm back in my bed. I'm going to sleep. So that's what she recalled under hypnosis. But consciously, she did remember parts of this. So the next morning, Betty ran outside to see if there was any evidence of a train coming through her backyard. Of course, there wasn't, but she vividly remembered the strange humming sound. And in fact, anytime she heard anything similar to that sound, she would feel a profound anxiety sweeping over her. And she did notice one other strange after effect of the encounter. As Betty says, the experience left me with precognitive abilities, clairvoyance, clairaudience, clairsentience, and what is now referred to as telekinesis, or control over matter. So that was her first experience. And it wasn't long after that one that she had her second experience. And in fact, it was that same summer. And again, she recalled much of it under hypnotic regression by researcher David Gottlieb. As Betty says in her own words, I was lying on the grass. It was daytime. The grass was moving, and I saw the ship. The craft is on the ground. There are beings here. They have yellow skin and it's wrinkled. I think they have a sense of humor. They have dark eyes, piercing. It's another type of craft. The craft is pointed at the ends, flat, like a saucer. They don't stand up in the craft. They have to use bays to lie down to go into flight. The craft is very flat. It has contours, domes, but the sides are ellipses. They just fit into areas which contour to their bodies when they lay down. They look as if they're comfortable. So Betty doesn't recall a whole lot of what happened once she was taken on board. She did see that they were flying high above the earth. At one point, one of the ETs seemed to show an interest in her hair and started touching it. And as Betty says, I didn't want them to do that. The next thing she knew, she was returned home. She heard her mother calling, and that was it. Now, there are some interesting aspects to Betty's life because at age 16, she developed a very strong interest in electronics and actually built a transformer in the basement of their home. This is something a number of contactees have experienced. Her next encounter occurred many years later. It was July 12th, 1959 or 1961, thereabouts. But he was now about 30 years old and living in the York Mills area of Toronto at 29 Upper Canada Drive, next to what was then the St. Andrews Golf Course, now a park. Now the encounter began with her being floated along the ground and suddenly up into a brightly lit craft which was hovering outside her balcony. This was a small craft, she estimates about 7 feet wide, 4 squarish portholes, a dome on top. She saw a small ramp. She suddenly found herself inside a wedge-shaped room. She saw a shiny instrument of some kind on the wall with red, green, yellow, blue, and white-colored squares. Kind of reminded her of a calendar. She saw a number of things that she found very hard to describe. As Betty says, there's a doorway with funny-looking things across it in a horizontal pattern. They look like fibrous rods. I think you could walk right through them and you wouldn't feel them. Just in front of the door, there's a mat. It looks like it's part of the floor. It's only about a foot wide and about 3 feet long. It's dark brown and fuzzy. She saw other things, something she described as an index wheel with a handle and small beige pouches affixed to it. Other rooms could be seen. She says the gray type ETs wore gray robes. They put a bib-like covering on her and then placed her on a movable steel table and proceeded to examine her with a strange cylindrical-shaped instrument. At one point, she says, the table tilted upwards so that she was almost standing. They told her, look the other way. And when she did, she saw a small box filled with, quote, tiny pellets. And they began to put these pellets into a device shaped kind of like a parking meter, she said. It was, quote, a creamy white color. Now she believes that these pellets may have been implants, given what happened next. And I'll just quote Betty directly. As she says, they're putting a pellet on the end of the instrument. The instrument looks like a combination of pliers and pinchers. One of them pushes the end of the instrument with the palm of his hand, and the pellet is firmly held by the instrument. The pellet has two prongs sticking out of it at one end. One of them is adjusting the handle of it. Someone says, "This one won't need any help." They put it on the outside of my left ear, on the cartilage back of my ear. I hear a buzzing sound from it. It has lights flashing on it. It's cold when they put it in my ear. "It's done," one of them says. They just took it out, took off the bag. I felt no pain during the operation. Now one of them says, "Home now." And they are taking me by the elbows. We're floating. They're taking me out of the ship. We're going through my balcony door into the living room. There's a large solid light on the balcony. I'm in the bed now. So this again was all recovered under hypnosis, but Betty woke up the next morning with no memory of being taken on board, but she did find that her ear was red, swollen, and itchy, and she just assumed that she had been bitten by an insect. Now, it was some years later, 1966, that Betty had her fourth encounter. She was unable to remember how the experience began, but she recalled being floated up into a craft which was hovering above what she thinks might have been Lake Ontario. And as Betty says in her own words, "There were two beings on board. One was facing me while the other had his back to me as he worked on the dials on the panel in front of him. They had large, squarish, round heads with no obvious neck. The eyes were spaced far apart. They had large noses. The skin was gray-white. They had no hair. Their hands were five-digited with stubby fingers and 3/4 inch webbing between the fingers. The most remarkable facial feature was the nose, with nostrils ending in two little elephant-like trunks about 3 or 4 inches below the collarbone. She says the ETs put something on my neck which looks like a combination lock. It burns a little." So she had trouble describing some of this. But the next morning while taking a shower, she noticed a small round burn-like mark about the size of a silver dollar at the base of her neck, and it faded away after 3 days. Now, what she believes was her fifth and final encounter occurred on December 22nd, 1979. It was a foggy night as she and her brother drove along Highway 9 between Upper Canada Mall and Highway 400. This is north of Toronto. You can see the spot here on a map. It was a trip which normally took about 15 minutes, but inexplicably took almost an hour. So there was a period of at least 20 minutes of missing time. And during this trip, she consciously recalled that they had entered into this dense black cloud. And upon coming out, there were strangely no more cars ahead of them, whereas before there had been. So years later, under hypnosis, she went back to this incident to explore it and recalled that their car had been stopped by human-looking figures dressed in gray-green coveralls. They pulled her out of the car, leaving her brother behind. They took her into a room, which she said was kind of green-colored. She said she was examined by a strange instrument. She doesn't really remember a whole lot, but she was then returned to her car, where she saw her brother sitting rigid and entranced in the car seat. They then drove off. All memories of the UFO and the onboard experience were erased from her conscious mind. Now, in 1986, having had all these strange incidents, Betty did elect to go under hypnosis, and she recalled these 5 onboard encounters. And, believing she had an implant behind her left ear, Betty agreed that upon her death, doctors could remove her implant. But she ended up having it removed in 1988, possibly 89. There's some confusion here, but it was 3 years before she actually passed away in 1992. And she was pretty sure that this was an implant of some kind, given what she recalled. And this thing did apparently show up on some medical tests. And she could also hear Morse-like codes coming from it. So this alleged implant was in fact removed at York County Hospital in Newmarket and was kept safe until 1994, until it was able to be studied by an engineer by the name of George Hathaway. Now this object was about 1 millimeter in diameter, and an analysis by an electron microscope revealed that it was composed of various elements such as aluminum, titanium, and silicon, with traces of other elements, just a little bit of iron, potassium, calcium, sulfur, chlorine, chromium, and sodium. Now, Lawrence J. Fenwick, the editor of the Q-Forn Bulletin, who studied the implant, writes that the Dagenais implant was either a transmitter or a receiver, possibly both. Now, this is pure speculation, but it's based on the fact that these elements that were found in the implant are used for similar human-constructed devices. Certainly a compelling case, and in fact, Betty's case is one of the best investigated, best confirmed cases of a contactee from Canada, and certainly a really interesting case involving an ET implant, which was very well studied and turned out to be quite unusual. So an important case by all counts. And now we move to another case which is not very well known. I call this one the case of Sharon Keefe. She's had several encounters, but she really only talked a lot about one of them. This occurred in 1975 or thereabout in Gallup, New Mexico, while driving along a lonely highway late at night with her 3 daughters. This is a multiple witness case, and a very interesting one in a number of different ways, as we shall see. Sharon Keefe's first sighting of a UFO occurred when she was only 11 or 12 years old. But as she grew up, she began to have more contact. In 1975 through 1976, she was living in Gallup, New Mexico, and she says it was here that she experienced several episodes of what she calls time losses, and each of these were about 1 to 2 hours long. And having all these missing time experiences, finally she decided to get some help and found Dr. Leo Sprinkle, PhD, and she went under hypnotic regression to explore the missing time. So it was one evening, again somewhere around 1975 or 1976, that she was driving with her 3 young daughters across the Zuni Indian Reservation. This is about 65 miles outside of Gallup, New Mexico. And I'll just let Sharon describe what happened next. As she says, "I learned through hypnosis about one experience which I will relate to you. A light appeared behind the car, suddenly, and I knew there were no other cars here. I couldn't find out where the light came from, but it was tailing me very closely. I told my daughters to turn around and see if it was a truck. So she asked them, 'What is that?' Her daughters had no answer. Sharon was aware that there was a lot of alcoholism with a problem in the area. She wondered if it was perhaps a drunk person who was tailgating her, and needless to say, she was quite concerned about it. So she accelerated her vehicle, finally reaching speeds of 85 miles per hour, but still this light, whatever it was, remained right behind her. And in fact, it was so bright that she had to adjust both her side mirror and her rear view mirror to block the light. Now this is where her conscious memory ends. The next thing she remembers is arriving in Gallup, New Mexico. So under hypnosis, she recalled what happened. She recalled being pulled on board a craft. She's not sure how this happened. She just suddenly found herself inside a strange room. And again, I'll just let Sharon describe this. As she says, "I know I was in the spaceship, and doors appeared instantly in white walls. The aliens seem to get where they want to go instantly, and they tend to move non-laboriously. And when they were going to take me through it, an opening appeared. The wall would be a wall, for instance. I can't explain this fact very well either. In this round spaceship, the beings appeared to be about 6 feet tall and were very pale, gray-white. They have heads that are similar to ours, only a little bit rounder in the cranial area. Their eyes large, their noses are small and narrow. Their ears aren't formed like ours. Their mouths are very like a line and small. They communicate mentally. They don't talk with their mouths like we do, but you can understand what they are saying and what they are telling you. I was in a separate room from the girls. It was like a pie-shaped room, with one chair, which was very comfortable and warm. There were some windows from which I was being viewed by other beings, about 15 feet in front of this chair. I couldn't see them very well because the glass was a smoky color. The being who guided me had a close-fitting suit, similar to what we know of as tights, but the material was of a smooth texture. They had cloaks on that were clasped at the neck, with a bright round nuclear symbol with the Star of David in the middle, and a hood that was also attached. I was worried about my daughters, so one alien took me to two other rooms, just like the one I was in, and showed me that they were all right. Both girls appeared to be asleep in chairs, just like the one I had been in. My guide then took me back to the room I had previously been in, and they did some kind of testing to me that felt like my body was being pulled apart. Now, Sharon says a lot more happened. There was a lot more detail to this. She didn't really want to share it. But at some point, the next thing she knew, she and her daughters were back in the car arriving in Gallup. And it was now 1.5 hours later. Sharon does say that the encounter changed her life immensely, and that ultimately it was a very positive experience. As Sharon says, my religious beliefs have become much stronger because I know that the universe is so enormous. You know that there are other galaxies, other planets, and other life. They are not here to harm us. I feel a lot of love in my heart and compassion for many people, anybody that I can help. My attitude towards life has changed drastically since my experience. I am much more positive. I know I can accomplish anything I want to, and the Supreme Being is my guide. It is nice to see everybody here and know that I am not the only one who has had strange experiences with UFO people. So Sharon revealed this all publicly at the Rocky Mountain UFO conference organized by Leo Sprinkle. A lot of people who were having experiences spoke there. And Sharon decided not to undergo any further hypnotic regressions, not because she was afraid or anything like that. She said her life was just too busy. I have to give kudos to Sharon Keefe for going public at a time when this subject was receiving quite a bit of ridicule. She did allow her real name to be used. A really interesting series of events. I do wonder what happened with her other encounters, but I certainly understand if she wants to keep those private. And yeah, I'm glad she did step forward. I think so many people are having these experiences. A lot of them have no recourse. They feel quite alone. But the fact is, this is a lot more common than most people realize. And now let's move to our next case, which did actually receive quite a bit of attention, certainly in the country where it took place, of Brazil. And I call this one the case of Herminio and Bianca Reis. You may have heard of it before. I don't know. But I think if you haven't, you will certainly find it compelling. This took place, the main incident, on January 12, 1976, not far from Matias Barbosa, Brazil. This is another one of those encounters that occurred while they're driving along a lonely highway late at night. It's certainly a compelling case involving multiple witnesses and a whole lot of information. And, of course, not just one encounter, but many. This next case involves a married couple by the name of Herminio Reis. He's an evangelical pastor, and his wife, Bianca de Oliveira. They woke up early on the morning of January 12, 1976, and while eating breakfast, decided that they would drive from their home in Minas Gerais, Brazil, and travel to Belo Horizonte to sell their old car. It was a sporty Carmanguia. So this ended up being an all-day trip. They were returning home along the Rio de Janeiro Belo Horizonte highway. It was around 11:30 p.m. They had just passed through Parabuna when Herminio, who was driving, began to feel strangely and excessively tired and sleepy. So they decided to pull off the highway while Herminio dozed, and Bianco stayed awake, smoking a cigarette and keeping watch to make sure nothing happened. And it was after about 15 minutes that Bianca noticed a light moving from one side of the sky to another. At the same time, she said this weird, all-encompassing dead silence fell over the area. So she's looking at this light, and she thought at first that it might be a balloon of some kind, but it was glowing this intense orange, and it was moving in and out of the clouds. It seemed pretty far away at first, so she didn't think too much of it, but then it disappeared, and it suddenly reappeared much closer. And very suddenly, it looked like it was an aircraft about to crash into them. So she screamed out to her husband, "Herminio! Herminio, wake up! A plane is falling on our heads." So he woke up just in time for them both to see everything around them become completely black, to the point that they couldn't even see themselves or each other. Their car seemed to move and shake a little bit, and then very suddenly a blinding bright beam of blue-white light appeared around them. And the couple felt as if they were being, quote, absorbed up into it, as if through a chimney. Moments later, they found themselves in a brightly lit round room, which they described as a, quote, kind of circular garage, about 70 feet wide. They were still sitting in their car. They did see another car inside, by the way. So as soon as they found themselves there, this little kind of door or opening appeared in the ceiling above them, and two tall men appeared and floated down to the car. They were human-looking. They had slanted green eyes, black hair, darkish skin, were quite tall, about 6 feet, maybe 6 inches. They were very similar-looking, almost like twins, they said. And they were both dressed in seamless white jumpsuits. These two figures were very cordial, very friendly, and smiling, and they began to help Herminio out of the car. Bianca didn't want to get out, but they got her out as well. The couple was understandably surprised and quite frightened. The two men were speaking to them in an incomprehensible language, and both Bianca and Herminio started to panic. Bianca started screaming at them, "What do you want? What do you want?" While her husband Herminio kept saying, "It's a mistake. It's a mistake." He said he felt almost as if they were in some kind of crazy dream. And in fact, he tried to call on Jesus to make these figures go away, and did this for quite some time. It didn't work. The ETs did not react to it. They just kind of stared at him. It took quite some time to calm them down, but they did calm down, at which point one of the men stepped on this little button on the floor, and the staircase or elevator type device appeared, and the men led the couple up into another room. Now they gave them these small silver headsets or headphones to put on. One of the other men also wore one of these devices and seemed to attach it to another instrument of some kind, adjusted a few dials, and then suddenly the man began to speak in their language and said, "I am Karan. Calm down." Now, this is a very complicated incident. A lot happened. According to the Reeses, this small craft reportedly went into a larger mothership, which the couple exited. They saw other craft the same size, and this being began to explain that they were from a distant planet they called Clermer. Actually showed them a star map of some kind, which showed their planet and others. And this being began to discuss very deep philosophical concepts to them, so all about religion, creation, contact with humans, all kinds of topics. They said that on their world they'd overcome the problem of aging, which was treated like a disease, that when they died they just left the body and retained all their memories and moved into a new body. They said they had no religion, no money, no wars. At one point, one of the beings asked Bianca if she would submit to being physically examined, which she did. She was placed in a box-like device which turned red and became filled with kind of this static electric charge. This caused her to temporarily lose consciousness. She said they proceeded to examine her skin, her ears, her eyes. And when she woke up, she was then taken out of that and put into a form-fitting chair, which she said actually would convert to a sort of table or bed. At some point, they were offered this soft, tasteless bread, They were asked to drink a thick green liquid, which they said had an unpleasant taste. At one point, more entities appeared, all of the same general appearance. One was a tall female with dark hair and large dark eyes. Now, Herminio asked Karen why the ETs didn't communicate with the people of Earth and help them with their problems. And Karen pointed to himself and said, "Am I not here?" And then he gestured at the craft and the other entities around them and said, "Are we not here?" So Herminio asked many questions and asked if Karen could teach them something that could be shared with all of humanity that would help alleviate all the suffering that is taking place on Earth. And Karen explained what he called, quote, conscious unfolding techniques. And these involved 3 main steps. Now, the first is hyperventilation breathing exercises, which Karen said would help aid cellular and cerebral regeneration. The second, he said, is to develop the pituitary and pineal glands to increase self-awareness and psychic awareness. And the third was to awaken specific points in the brain to allow for conscious astral projection. Now, as the experience came to an end, they were told not to speak about their experiences to other people who would likely think they were crazy. And the ETs said that they did have a method that would cause them to forget. Bianca said that she wanted to remember and asked the ETs not to make them forget, and this was a request which they granted. The couple was then taken back to their car and returned to the highway. They drove home in silence. Bit by bit, they began to talk about the experience. This took a couple of weeks. They shared it with others later. And as they got more comfortable with it, they began to appear on radio and TV. And they actually began to teach the techniques to others that were taught to them by the ETs. Now, Bianca believes that the ETs did implant her, which allowed her to remain in communication with Karen. And apparently she was the focus of contact, not so much her husband. And she started to get telepathic messages to go to certain areas. And sure enough, the craft would arrive and she would be taken on board. So this happened a number of times. On one occasion, she asked to bring friends, and the being told her, well, you can bring some friends, but not the ones you're talking about. They're not your friends. They're trying to take advantage of you, and gave her some advice on this. So at some point, yes, she was able to take a couple of other friends on board, one who was allegedly healed. She said that she also met one of the ETs who was living, at least temporarily, on Earth, but looked very much the same as the other beings she saw. She said at some point she was given a major revelation of some kind, which apparently she has not yet talked about. But their case is quite extensive. And in fact, researcher Wendell Stevens ended up co-authoring a book on the case called UFO Contact from Clermont. How amazing is that? It's so interesting to me that in so many of these cases, people talk about the after effects of experiencing a bunch of psychic events. So that, I think, is a really important takeaway from cases like these. An encounter is often somewhat spiritually enlightening to some degree. That's certainly the pattern we see in so many cases. And now we move to another one that's super interesting, primarily because of its location, Iran. We just don't get a lot of cases from there. And I suspect there are many, we just don't hear about them. But this one is called the case of Ghulam Reza Bazarani, and it took place on April 2nd, 1976, near Shalu, Iran, and got a lot of attention because it turns out the primary witness came from a pretty upstanding family, and there's some really unusual elements to this case, as we shall see. It is somewhat brief compared to the other cases. We don't have a whole lot of information, but it certainly deserves to be known. This very unusual case occurred on April 2nd, 1976, which at that year was actually an Iranian holiday called Sizde Badar. This marks the end of the Iranian New Year, and it's all about celebrating nature. The main witness was a 19-year-old teenager by the name of Gholam Reza Bazargani. He's the member of a wealthy family in Chalu, Iran, and he had gone hiking into the nearby woods and suddenly disappeared without a trace. Naturally, his family called the police. There was a huge search organized to find him, but they could not find him anywhere. And then, 2 days later, Gholam was found some hundreds of miles to the south in the city of Isfahan. And Gholam had quite a story to tell. He said that while he was walking alone in the forest, a UFO appeared overhead, flew directly towards him, stopped right over his head. He was unable to move as 4 beings appeared. According to some sources, they had big noses and kind of greenish lips. Could not confirm that, but he says they came out of the craft on a sort of a silver ladder and pulled him on board. And Gholam now found himself inside an oval-shaped room in front of a strange instrument of some kind. He couldn't really describe it. He says they passed various colored lights over his body as these strange beings scrutinized him. After just a few moments of this, he lost consciousness. And as Gholam says in his own words, "The next thing I remember is that I woke up back on Earth early in the morning, not in the lush Caspian forests, but surrounded by barren lands." So he didn't know where he was. He had to hike his way back to civilization and found that he was in fact in Isfahan. This is about 285 miles south of Toulouse, where he was taken. So he immediately contacted the local police. He was taken to the Red Lion and Sun Hospital in Isfahan and examined by doctors and psychologists. After 1 day of this, he was given a clean bill of health, both physically and mentally, and he returned back to his home in Toulouse. Now, there were some people who were skeptical of his account, but authorities said that on the day of Gholam's return, numerous people from the villages of Marbin and Lenjan, which outlie the Isfahan city, they called the police to report their sightings of a flying saucer, quite a few of them. Now, the only lasting symptom that Gholam reported was that his wristwatch, which he had been wearing at the time he was taken on board, was missing after the encounter. I do wish there was more information in that case, but certainly compelling, and I think quite a good amount of corroboration given that so many people saw UFOs in the area at the time that he was being apparently returned to a location somewhat distant from where he was taken, which is also quite unusual. A really interesting case, and I have to wonder what happened to his watch, if it's still up there on a craft somewhere. I don't know, but it's a fascinating detail. And now we move to the next case. This one definitely deserves more attention. It's a really interesting case. This I call the case of Miguel Herrero Sierra. It's a fascinating onboard experience which occurred on December 18, 1977 in a rural area of Tendia, Spain. Again, another case of someone being taken along a highway that's somewhat remote, and a fascinating case with a lot of information to it. The sole witness to this case is Miguel Herrero Sierra. He's a 37-year-old driver and entrepreneur who on December 18, 1977 decided to take a fishing trip. Fishing is one of his favorite hobbies. At the time of his experience, he lived in Alcalá, Spain. This is not far from Madrid. And it was around 5:30 a.m. that he got into his pickup and began the long drive to the Buendia reservoirs. This is his favorite fishing spot. So after driving for over an hour, he was near Tendia. And it was actually at the intersection of the Penalver Road, as you can see here, when suddenly the headlights, radio, and engine of his vehicle all simultaneously shut off. He did manage to pull over off the road. He got out and checked his truck, couldn't find anything wrong. It was still dark, so he decided to wait until dawn to see if he could get help. So as he's sitting there in his truck, this is when he noticed a huge shadow in the field next to him, about 300 feet away. And he wondered briefly if it could be a house, But the thing is, he knew this area. He knew there was no house in that location. And this is when suddenly a brilliant beam of light came from that object and shone directly on his car. And at the same time, he heard someone shout out, "Hey, mister, the one with the pickup." So this confused him a little bit. He wondered if perhaps there had been an accident of some kind. So he exited his truck and began to slowly approach this object. And as he got closer, he said he smelled this very strange, penetrating, piney odor that grew very strong, stronger as he approached, and became so strong it finally caused him to become nauseous and dizzy, so much so that he fell to the ground. He was now dazed, semi-conscious, unable to move, he says, when he saw two men approaching him from about 150 feet away. He noticed immediately that they were dressed strangely in what he described as a diver's suit. Now these two men spoke to each other in an incomprehensible language. They then grabbed Miguel's arms tightly and led him into the craft. He now saw that this craft was floating just a few feet in the air. It did have what looked like a cylinder of some kind extending out from the bottom center and leading to the ground. And what happened next actually took him a few weeks after the experience to consciously recall, but he did remember. He remembered that he was led inside this cylinder into a doorway and suddenly found himself inside a room which was quite large, about 45 feet wide. He says the walls looked quite strange, almost crystal or plastic-like. He saw a circular central area which he believed might have been the cockpit or the control center. He saw transparent-looking counters, a bed area, what looked like small metal cabinets, some consoles with lights and levers, a computer-like screen, a lot of stuff that he had difficulty describing. And he found out that the ETs were able to turn the walls of the craft transparent. So I'll just quote Miguel directly, as he says, "Two men dressed in white were coming towards me. I didn't lose consciousness, but I was unable to walk until they took me by the arms. I remember that just before entering, a sort of sliding door opened. The entire underside of the artifact lit up in a deep white light. Once inside, nothing and no one held me, but although I was already strong and the tension was through the roof, I could not move or articulate any word. Amazingly, when I was inside, I understood everything they were talking about." So inside he saw a lot of these figures, about 16 of them, which he said, quote, "had such a similar appearance to us that if they had been dressed differently, they could have gone unnoticed anywhere on Earth." And for the next 3 hours, he communicated telepathically with the ETs. As Miguel says, "I hadn't really spoken a word since I left the car, and they were not emitting any sound either, yet I could hear their words in my ears as if we were having a normal conversation." So he's talking about telepathy here. Didn't quite understand what that was apparently. But as he says, "I also remember that at a certain moment when I was trying to assimilate everything that was happening and an endless number of questions invaded my mind, one of them turned around and looking me in the eye, said without saying a word, 'Don't make an effort to understand, because if no one explains it to you, you will never understand it.' So they were just trying to calm him down because he was becoming mentally overwhelmed. Then suddenly, with no memory of how he got there, he found himself outside the craft. He did notice a small puncture in his arm, as if he had been given a blood test, though he had no conscious memory of this. The entire experience, he learned, lasted about 3 hours. And while he did have some memory of the onboard experience come back to him naturally, he could only recall about 15 minutes of it. So there was still much that he couldn't recall. And later, after talking to researchers, he did elect to go under hypnosis to see if he could recall more details. And he did. He says that the ETs told him that the Great Pyramids of Egypt were in fact designed by extraterrestrials. They told him that there was an old abandoned ET base in the Bermuda Triangle. They told him they could make their ships invisible at will. They told him that they did not need weapons of any kind, as they could create a magnetic field around their ship which would prevent anyone or anything from getting too close, anything that could bring any danger to them. They said that they had been visiting Earth for thousands of years, and that they were sharing genetics with Earth humans. He did see a weird panel on the ship, consciously recalled that, but under hypnosis did see what looked like weird Russian-like symbols on them. And he also recalled something else quite odd. One of the crew members looked almost exactly like himself. So that really confused him. He tried to reach out and touch this man, but the others warned him not to do that. But it was at this time that Miguel says he became so overcome that he felt his nerves were going to explode. And this is when one of the ETs turned towards him and told him not to make an effort to understand at this time. So that's basically his experience. The only other real after effect is Miguel says that following his encounter, he started to develop all kinds of psychic abilities. So many interesting details in that case. The fact that he says the ETs looked pretty much exactly like us and could have walked undetected if dressed in different clothes. And there we have that pattern again where he comes away from his experiences and starts having all these psychic events happen. Super interesting. And now we move to the final case of this little collection here. I call this one the Case of Helen. We don't know her last name. She has elected to be anonymous. Certainly understandable. This case occurred, actually it's a series of events, through January and February of 1992 in Mezobereni, Hungary. And this is a fascinating case with some really interesting physiological effects because apparently this witness was healed. I love these kinds of cases. It's very encouraging, and I think you'll find this case quite compelling. This case was investigated by Laszlo Kiss of the Hungarian UFO Research Network, or HUFON. The main witness is Helen. This is apparently a pseudonym. Now, on January 24, 1992, Helen, who was 50 years old at the time of her encounter, she was in the kitchen when she saw something very strange. A dull black, kind of egg-shaped, quote, something. It was blue-gray on top. It had a vertical orange stripe down the center. It seemed to vibrate. She had very much difficulty describing this, but she said it made a, quote, strong snorting sound as it moved across the kitchen and into another room. Now, next to this orange stripe that she saw, Helen did see the face of a woman looking out at her. And Helen's husband was with her during this time, but he was looking in the other direction. And when this thing appeared, Helen found herself unable to speak to alert him. But after it moved into the other room, she followed, and there was nothing there. She told her husband, but he did not believe her. But weird events had just begun, because it was that night, around 6:30 p.m., that she suddenly became overcome with tiredness and decided to go to bed early. Her husband was watching TV in the same room when suddenly Helen heard a woman's voice say, "Lift your arm," which she did. She says she immediately felt a strong twinge of pain on her elbow. And was following this, she felt compelled to walk out into the backyard, which she did. She was dressed only in her nightgown. She went outside and saw a large, egg-shaped object which had landed in her yard. And she went inside of it. She was surprised to see a wide, gray room. There was nothing in it. It was completely empty of any furniture or people, though she did see a doorway at the far end. She apparently had a lapse in consciousness because the next thing she knew, she was in this same room, only it was now filled with people. She said there were about 10 or 15 children, all young, about age 10 to 13, and they were all standing on the right side of the room. On the left side of the room, she said were about 8 to 10 women who were all around her age. And in fact, Helen recognized one of the women from her neighborhood. All of the people in the room, including Helen, had no clothes on, so she does not know how this happened. But at this point, Helen walked to the doorway at the end of the room, and that's the last thing she consciously remembered. Her next memory was feeling a pain in her stomach and laying down in bed. And getting up, she saw it was now 9:30 p.m., 3 hours later than it had been. Her husband was still watching TV. He noticed nothing unusual. When Helen woke up the next morning, she said she felt minor pain and pressure on the upper part of her belly. Didn't think much of it, went to work, and the next night went to bed early. And that night, she said she had a repeat on-board encounter with pretty much all the same details. And the same thing happened on the third night. But it was on Thursday night that Helen examined her body and was shocked to see several round spots, each about the size of a silver dollar, on her abdomen and upper chest. You can see a photograph of them here. She said there was no pain, no itching or sensitivity of any kind. She did find what looked like 4 needle marks on the outer part of her elbows, which did exhibit some minor pain and burning sensations. She said she also had a little bit of trouble breathing for a short time. But after 7 days, these marks were still there, so she was concerned and went to the doctor, told him what happened, showed him the marks on her body. He was very much puzzled and sent her to see a dermatologist, who was also puzzled. He could not explain the marks, but he just prescribed a medical cream. But here's where it gets really interesting. There was an amazing and very positive development. Helen found that her general health began to improve in a few areas. At the time of her encounters, she was suffering from varicose veins and very poor hearing in her left ear. But following her encounters, her varicose veins disappeared and she regained her hearing in her left ear. So that was it. Her encounters were over. There was one final strange event. 2 weeks later at 3:30 a.m. on February 11, 1992, Helen woke up to see her husband standing in a very odd posture. He was holding one arm up. He was using his other arm to hold his sleeve up, as if he was waiting for an injection in his arm. This puzzled and concerned her. She tried to wake him up, but he was in a trance of some kind. She could not wake him up. She was able to get him to put his arm down, and that was it. So there you go. True, not a whole lot of information to that case. Still many questions surrounding it, but she was apparently healed of both varicose veins and partial deafness. Really interesting. I have to wonder if her husband was involved, just given what she described, though he has no memory of this. It's certainly interesting, and it makes you wonder how many people have these events and just never talk about them, because the closer the encounter, the less likely it is for a witness to come forward, because of all the ridicule and skepticism and disbelief surrounding this subject. Such a shame. But as you can see, these cases have occurred all over the world for a very long time. I think, I understand skepticism. I was skeptical for many years. But if you just leave your beliefs behind, your preconceptions, and take a look at the evidence, I think you'll find it extremely persuasive. I mean, there's no doubt something is going on. I think the evidence is at this point conclusive. We are being visited. We are not alone. The universe is not empty. Many people are being taken on board craft and having all kinds of amazing experiences. So that's the episode for today. I really want to thank you for watching. It's because of all you guys out there that I do these episodes, do all this research, working so hard to find these cases. But I'm having fun. I hope you are too. So until next time, keep asking those hard questions. The answers are there. Keep searching for the truth. It's up to you to find it. And most important of all, keep having fun, because that's why we're here. And I will see you next week. Until then, bye for now.